Now, Bill, as somebody who was so close to this campaign, I suspect you're still in poetry mode, but let us know what you're thinking.
Sure. I'll return to foreign policy at the end of our remarks, but just to say at the outset that Bronwyn's position is much closer to mine than Andrew's, I must say. I think it's understandable that we have focused so much on the personality of a truly extraordinary candidate that we have perhaps overlooked something that's happening underneath the surface that goes beyond and even precedes his candidacy. It takes nothing away from the particular characteristics and the qualities as a person and as a candidate of Barack Obama, nor does it take anything away from the admiration that I and anyone, regardless of party affiliation, who has been involved in politics for any length of time, have for the kind of campaign that they ran. I've been involved in American politics for over 40 years, and I've never seen one run with quite the efficiency and purpose and success as this one was. But I think underneath there's some seismic changes taking place in American politics. You saw, in fact, I think, on election night, the tectonic plates of American politics begin to move. And let me explain what I mean by that. And it takes some awareness of the American party system over a period of time. Throughout most of American politics for the last 150 years, there's been one dominant party who, in any normal election, would elect the president and both houses of Congress. That was true, for example, from 1896 to 1932, a 36-year period of Republican dominance. In that 36 years, there was only one Democrat who served, and that was Woodrow Wilson, and he was elected only because the Republican Party was split and there was a third-party candidate, the former President Teddy Roosevelt. From 1932 to 1968, the period of Democratic dominance, there was only one Republican who served, and that was Dwight Eisenhower, a war hero who 4 years before he ran was assumed to be a Democrat, and some liberal Democrats, including FDR's son, tried to get him to run against Harry Truman for the Democratic nomination. In 1968, another critical election, another transformative election, as political scientists and historians call it, you saw with Richard Nixon's strategy of peeling off certain elements of the Democratic coalition on cultural and social issues, you saw the rise of an incipient Republican majority that would dominate for the next generation. It was not wholly consummated, in part because of Watergate, and also because later Ronald Reagan, who followed the same strategy of splitting off the so-called Reagan Democrats, was unable to transfer his personal popularity to that of his party. Nonetheless, for the last 40 years, since 1968, there have been only 3 Democratic terms, as president, only 12 of the 40 years, and one of those was Jimmy Carter, elected in the wake of Watergate. Otherwise probably would not have been elected, and Bill Clinton, who was elected twice, neither time getting more than 50% of the vote, and winning in 1992, solely because, again, there was a very strong third-party candidate. I think you may very well have seen on Tuesday evening a critical election, again, a realigning election. The rise of a new coalition to dominance in American domestic politics that will dominate for the next generation. Now, a lot depends, obviously, upon the success of the administration. I'm a little more hopeful than Andrew is, I must say. But in any case, a lot depends upon that, to be sure. And Obama was, in a sense, ideally suited as a candidate and as a person to bring about that kind of seismic change. But this election had a lot of the characteristics that transformational elections, critical elections, typically have. They're usually preceded by a precursor election that foreshadows the change, and that was true in 2006 when we gained control of the Senate, winning in places where we don't normally win, Virginia and Montana, for example. It's also true that the shift typically builds upon shifting demographic patterns in the United States, as it did with the rise of the urban immigrants in the 1920s, foreshadowing what happened in the 30s with FDR, and as it builds now upon the rise of a new minority within the states, the Hispanics. As important as this election was for Black Americans, symbolically, an incredibly important event, surely, it is also important for the rise of Hispanics politically. It is also true that it generally energizes new elements who appear in force in the body politic and in the election, and that certainly occurred this time. It's also true that typically it involves the consolidation of one party's position in one region of the country or another, and that certainly happened here. Little notice is what has happened in the Northeast. The Republican Party, the old liberal, moderate Republican Party, is largely gone in the Northeast. 23 out of 29 representatives from New York will be Democrats. Same ratio in In New Jersey, Chris Shays, the moderate Republican from Connecticut, is in a sense the last Republican holdout. He went down to defeat last Tuesday as well. You still have the two Republican senators moderate Republican senators from Maine, but that's really about it. So I think you're going to see, you have seen really, a seismic shift in American politics. Let me shift very quickly to foreign policy, and I would agree with both Andrew and with Bronman that there is enormous room for disappointment. The level of expectations raised by Obama's victory abroad and at home in foreign policy is far beyond, I think, the capacity of the administration to deliver. To some degree, that's inevitable. The strategic interests of the United States do not change simply with the change in occupancy of the White House. Those strategic interests remain the same. There will be significant changes, shifts in the method, the mode, the tone, the tenor of the conduct of American foreign policy. It will be much more consultative. It will be much more collaborative, to be sure. No longer will it be a bantam cock strutting around the barnyard or someone laying out a steak and expecting everyone else to follow in line when they've never been consulted. It's also true that there will be a change in emphasis, as Ron mentioned, from Iraq to Afghanistan. Obama's made clear from the very beginning he intends to have 3 additional brigades sent to Afghanistan. That was all along the center of, which should have been the center of our attention in the battle against Al-Qaeda. There was a briefing this past week of both campaigns, interestingly enough, by the intelligence forces in the States and by the White House of both campaigns on the situation in Afghanistan. It does indeed involve, as Ron mentioned, how we go forward, the degree to which we attempt to co-opt certain elements within the Taliban as we did with certain elements of the population in Iraq. It's also true that the other, and that particular effort will involve a request that will not necessarily be welcomed in much of Europe, certainly not in Berlin and Paris, of greater burden sharing, an old term from the 1980s and 1990s, of burden sharing for this new consultative, cooperative, collaborative effort. It's also true there will be renewed emphasis on the Middle East peace process. Sadly neglected by the Bush administration, no solution in the Middle East is going to be possible ever until the Palestinians and the Israelis themselves come to some agreement. America cannot impose that agreement, and it shouldn't. It has to be done by the participants, but nonetheless there can be consistent pressure there, as there was earlier in earlier Democratic administrations. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.